Hey everyone, I'm so excited for you to meet our guest speaker today. Pastor Mark Clark is a new friend of mine, and God is using him in a really special way. A few years ago, God laid on his heart to plant a church in Surrey, BC, Canada. The church is called The Village, and since the day it started, it's been blowing up, and God is using this church and Pastor Mark in a really exciting way. I'm also really excited to have him at Crossroads because, Pastor Mark, he's a little quirky. He's a little crazy. Let's face it, he's going to fit right in with us here at Crossroads. So do me a favor. As we love to love God by loving people, let's show Pastor Mark God's love from all of us here at Crossroads. Enjoy him.
One, two. All right. Sorry about that. That's awkward to start off that way. We're cool. All right. So good to be with you guys this morning. I am excited to be here. Yes, I'm a little quirky, like Pastor Danny, but you're not going to get more quirky than, some of you are like, how is this guy quirky compared to Pastor Daniel? Look at him. His hair, he doesn't look like the lead singer of Counting Crows. He's perfectly normal looking. His clothes fit nicely. Now, but here's the deal. I wasn't always this cleaned up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a bit of my story because I think it's helpful. I think if I just come in here and give you some kind of message, and there's no real connection point for you. You don't know me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unpack the gospel connected to my own story and kind of frame that in one of the most famous stories Jesus ever told. So if you have a Bible, it's Luke chapter 15. If you don't have a Bible, it is on the bulletin at the back. And I'm excited to be able to be here with you, to be able to share my story a little bit as I've got to know Pastor Daniel, as I've got to know Crossroads. You guys have so much to teach us as a young church. As Pastor Daniel said, we started out 4 years ago. My wife and I planted Village Church. We started out in a elementary school gym with 50 people, and we were excited that to preach the gospel, people would meet Jesus in our city. And so we started with 50 people, and we literally just started to pray and preach and do kids ministry. That was it. There was no complexity, right? It was simple. It was like, here, we want people to meet Jesus. I didn't grow up in the church. I'm going to tell you about that. And so I want to try to reach Canada. I don't know if you know this, it's a de-churched country. They're at least a generation. We are at least a generation or two ahead of America in regard to secularization. And so we talk about ourselves as a de-churched, post-Christian country. That literally we have been through Christianity, and as C.S. Lewis talked about, when you want to bring the gospel to a people, if you walk in and they're pre-Christian, you can come in and you explain the gospel to them and they kind of go, hey, I'm excited about this, the idea of God, the idea of, okay, I want this. But in a post-Christian culture, which Canada is, it's come through Christianity, it's come out the other side, and now it looks at it and it has all the reasons in the world to actually deny it. And so what we wanted to do was plant a church that would re-evangelize a country, that would reach people like I grew up totally unchurched, didn't know anything about God, didn't know anything about Jesus, until I went to a summer camp when I was a kid. And I heard, the first message I ever heard was about, I was a young kid, I was 9 years old, and some of you might have had the summer camp experience, where they run you tired for like 5 straight days, and then they sit you down in front of a big fire, and they do the turn or burn talk. All right? And the turn or burn talk is, so kids, you're all gathered, you're all tired, you're all emotional. Now, if you don't believe in Jesus, you're going to die and go to hell. And then they put a little gasoline. This is what my camp did. Put a little gasoline. And everyone just rushed forward. Counselors were coming to Christ. It was crazy, all right? Because it was out of sheer fear, right? And so now here's something that's true, that yes, all of that's true, but the reality is if your motivation for following God, loving God, moving toward God is fear, then when I grow up and become 17, 18, 19, and that becomes a caricature, I have really no motive, because what I did is I ran from something rather than running to something. And what we're going to see in this story is this beautiful presentation of the Father, who is someone that every single one of us needs to run toward, that would want to run toward, whether you are the younger son, which is many people in this room, and it's my story, or the older son. And this is why the prodigal son is a bad name for this story, because the story is actually about two sons. And what Jesus does in this story is he tells us, this is not just like a nice story that's trying to kind of get us into a sentimental mode about fatherhood and how they should hang with their kids. And that's not what this parable is about. You know that when Jesus told stories and parables, the point of those things were to literally blow up a paradigm and then start to reshuffle the furniture and reconstruct our entire lives. And so what he does is he takes this is like a grenade, just thrown into the midst of a culture to go, let me cause you to rethink everything you thought you knew about connecting with God. Whether you have an Eastern philosophy of life or a Western philosophy of life, whether you're totally religious or totally secular, Jesus is going to come at us with this story. He's going to say both are completely wrong ways of thinking about God and connecting to God. And we're going to see ourselves, everybody in this room should be able to see themselves in one of these two sons. And so, pick it up in Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 11. Jesus says this, "There was a man who had two sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me.'" So literally what he just did is he came to his father, and this would culturally be like saying, "Father, I want you to be dead." Right? Like, I know when you die, you're going to give me money. But here's the deal. I want you to be dead now so I can get the money now so I can go live the way I want now. Completely offensive to this father. Give me the share of the property that is coming to me. And he divided his... Now, I mean, that's true today too, right? Like, how many of us would go to our grandparents and be like, "Hey, I know you're not sick, but..." I was just thinking, my wife and I, we saw this really nice house. When you know that money you were kind of saving up for when you died, I'm getting a little impatient, right? Right? How many of us are having that awkward conversation, all right? Not many. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, verse 13, listen to what Jesus said. "Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in," what he says, this is a phrase, underline it if you got a pen, "in reckless living." All right, now, here's what reckless living is. Some of us in this room, this is your story. All right, you fit into this non-religious... You grew up, if anything like me, if you grew up in a home anything like mine, where when I finally became serious about Jesus and gave my life to Jesus when I was 17 years old, I would come to the dinner table. None of my family, like I grew up in a home, my father was so atheistic that he named my brother Matthew, and he spelt his name with one T as not to be biblical. All right, that was his conviction. Hold on. But then he had, 4 years later, he has me. Now, my name is Mark. So check this. He didn't even know. Like, if I had another, I guarantee you, I think Luke's great. John, let's do the... He so didn't know that he called, let's do the one T, and then, so when I finally I would come home and I love Jesus, and we'd sit at the dinner table, and they'd be like, this is a nice thing, that you have in your life, Mark, but it's not for us, right? You're kind of part of a cult. Right, and that's what my family would say. That was kind of their trajectory on this. This was their view on this. And so there's many people probably here that are similar to this, where you have lived recklessly. You're the younger son, and this is a story that's going to come back. Like you grew up in a non-religious home, secularized home. Nobody loved you. Nobody knows about it. Nobody. And this is you, and you're here, and you're exploring Christianity. You're exploring spirituality. It's a beautiful thing. And what this story is saying is, just because you grew up in that home, because Christianity is not about something that you just inherit from your parents or your grandparents, it's got to be real for you. Because that's true, you could be a reckless living, all right, son, where you just live, all right, you do whatever you want with your money. You do whatever you want with your sexuality. You do whatever you want with your friendships. You do whatever you want with your work life. You kind of live that life. And this is the younger son. He went to the father. He went to the father who represents God, and he said, you just give me the gifts. And what he did is he elevated gifts above giver. I want your money. And he doesn't realize, man, that every day you wake up, here's what I began to realize. Every day I wake up, even the breath in my lungs is a gift from God. The younger son is the kind of, he doesn't think about that. He doesn't recognize these gifts that come from the Father. So he just lives his life out the way he wants to live it. All right, and then verse 14. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired hands have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. Listen to this phrase. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. Now, here's what's going on. He comes to a place in his life where he recognizes his own sinfulness, and he comes to the Father and he goes, I am humble. This is the posture of a reckless living person. It's am I humble enough to ever come to a point where I say, you know what, I'm not even worthy. Now, here's what Jesus is doing, and here's why this is offensive to, I come from Vancouver, Canada. All right, Hala, who's been there? Yes, awesome. All right, so we're West Coasties, right? So here's what Jesus does in this moment. He starts to explode any worldview, any vision and version of humankind that people have come up with. He actually counters it. So here's what he says, and this is completely offensive. So if you're not someone who likes to be offended, here's what Jesus is doing to kind of offend you. So just let the soil of your heart receive it, all right, with joy. Here's what he says. You're not worthy. Now, here's why that's hard for us. We can see he's saying the reality is this younger son comes, he goes, I'm a sinner. I'm not worthy, which means Jesus is saying, hey, you know the different worldviews that humankind has come up with? West Coast, it's very popular to say humankind are gods. All right, there's two major worldviews about what humankind is. Jesus is blowing them both up. The first one is humankind are gods, right? So I'm West Coast. Everything's New Age. We're divine. You speak reality into existence. Rhonda Byrne, The Secret. When I go into a coffee shop, there's a karma jar. All right? And if I tip the person, good things are going to come back on me because I get to control the universe. All right? I'm God. All right? Karma jar. Give me a tip. Boom. Good things will happen. That's how where I live, that's how they think about humankind. And so they think about the law of attraction, that you can control your own universe. You are God. You're the center of everything. And so Rhonda Byrne wrote a book that sold millions and millions of copies. Some of you might have read it in your discovering spirituality. It's called The Secret. And The Secret's all about the law of attraction. You can just speak reality into existence, and the universe has to come back and give you those things. And so if you want a really big boat, Rhonda Byrne says all you need to do is take a picture of a boat, put it up on your fridge, and every day, imagine you in that boat. Imagine. And then you got to say this, because the universe has to hear. You got to go boat, 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 boat. Boat. I deserve a boat. I'm going to have a boat. I'm going to get a boat. I'm going to go to Italy. I'm a boat. And the more you say it, listen, this is not a suggestion. The universe has to respond and give this to you. All right, law of attraction. You are a god. Now, Jesus comes, he goes, no, you're not God's. You're unworthy. You need to come to a place in your life when you go, I am a sinner. Now, it should not be hard for you to ever come to terms with the fact, as Martin Luther defined sin, as humankind turned in on himself, homo incurvatus. And I see this in my kids all the time. I have 3 kids. I have 3 beautiful daughters, 7, 5, and 3. And what I see in these daughters is not a natural tendency to be selfless. All right, they don't wake up in the morning like my daughters. I will literally, they don't recognize the gifts that, they don't come to me and say, Father, I'm dependent on you for joy. They don't. Now, my kids walk with a swagger. All right, they're like, I own this house. They own that. They don't know that the only reason they got a trampoline outside and they got their friends over for sleepovers and we got pizza. They don't recognize us. They think they did that stuff. Like, that's messed up. And I will be driving along the road and my 3-year-old daughter will say from the back, Daddy, wrong direction. I'll be like, what did you say? What? Wrong? I know where I'm going. She goes, no, Dada, wrong direction. I'm like, okay, you can't say your name, so there's that. Just play Bubble Guppies on my iPhone and shut up, all right? I'm in control of this thing. Who do you think you are, 3 years old? But that's what we do as humankind. We think we're in control. We think we deserve it. And this story just came along and went, you're not worthy. Are you ever humble enough to ever come to a place in your life when you go, oh my goodness, what does the Son say? I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy. That Jesus, to the church in the book of Revelation, he says, I love it because he's so soft. He goes, you're wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. It's like we don't have a building yet as a church because we started out in a school and now we're in an auditorium and we got 2 different sites and they're both auditoriums, so we don't have a building. We're looking for a building, but when we do, I'm going to put that over the auditorium, like that verse is going over the auditorium as people, you're wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. Welcome to Village Church, right? Like, that's just crazy right there. Because usually, right now, how do our hearts respond when Jesus goes, hey, this is your reality, that you got to come to a place in your life when you don't walk with a swagger as a human being, you don't think you're God. Now, the other version, of course, is that we're animals, that we're not gods, but we're animals, just highly evolved animals. And this story comes and it breaks both of them apart and it says, no, you're not gods, but you're not animals. You're sons. You're daughters. You're children of God, made in his image. Now, if someone had come up to me when I was 17 years old and I divided up my time between partying, doing drugs, breaking into cars in order to get more money to buy more drugs. And someone had walked up to me when I was 17, and that was my life, that was my world, and said, you're a sinner. You're unworthy. I would have responded like maybe many of you feel when you read a text like this and go, I'm fine. There's nothing wrong. I don't have a problem. I'm good. I'm living life fine. I wake up in the morning. See, this is what we do. We tend to think that people without God, and you'll know this, if you don't have God in your life and you're here exploring, you'll know this, that sometimes Christians tend to think that people without God are just miserable. And they wake up every day and they're like, oh, I hate life. But nobody shows up, at my church anyway, pounding down the door saying, I woke up without God this morning and I needed the depth of my being to be totally transformed and give me meaning and they don't Because the problem is they don't tend to know their need. Right? This is why when the paralyzed man in Mark chapter 2 shows up to Jesus, what does he ask for when he's on the mat and they come through the roof? What is his desire? What does he want from Jesus? What's his first request? To be healed. He wants to walk. But it's awesome because what does Jesus do? What does Jesus start with? I'll forgive your sin. Now picture, this is awesome because the guy comes in, he's not asking the sin question, he's just saying, I want to walk. And Jesus totally ignores it and he's like, son, your sins are forgiven you. And the dude's like, what? The what? My what? Dude, I just want to walk. What do you mean my sin? What are you talking about? See, now, there's these felt needs that we come to the church with. There's these felt needs that we come to God with. I want to have a better marriage. I want to have more money. I want to have better emotional health. There's these felt needs. And then Jesus goes underneath and he goes, I'm going to solve an eternal need, not a temporal need. I'm going to forgive your sin even though you walked in here not necessarily thinking it was your sin that needed to be dealt with. That kind of story, when I started reading the Bible for myself, that started to blow me up a little bit. I was like, what? He doesn't even, see, Jesus is always trying to go deeper and meet a deeper need than you think he needs to meet because he's smarter than you on his worst day. Right? You could come in and approach God and be like, hey, I want to do this. And he goes, no. And why is that important? Jesus forgives the guy's sins because at some point, even if he heals him of being a paralyzed man, which he ultimately does do, ultimately, in a few years, what's going to happen to that guy? He's going to die. And so it's very important that Jesus deals with his eternal need, not his temporal need, because sooner or later, the guy's going to not be able to walk again. And so why would it be good to just, deal with this really surface temporal thing? He wants to go deeper. It's like when he heals Lazarus, when he raises Lazarus from the tomb, right, in John chapter 11. And Lazarus gets up from the tomb. It's not just that he raises Lazarus from the tomb. I mean, that's a great story, but if that's the whole thing, then sooner or later, what happened to Lazarus? Like, Lazarus isn't still walking around today. Lazarus died. Like, at some point in Lazarus' life, we're not really told when it is, he was walking around and went, that's familiar. And died again. Like, no, none of us really get to experience that. Twice. But what was important about it is Jesus went under this felt need and he met this deeper need. And so when I began to think about even my own life, I was this younger son. And I had this younger brother journey back to the Father. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he rose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And this is an amazing, the father moves toward him. And so me growing up in a non-Christian home, I began to explore Christianity. And now I'm someone who's always needed evidence for everything. All right, I'm someone who I've never been able to really just believe stuff because someone told me. Like when I was a kid, my mom actually said to me one time, I used to get on roller skates. This is a bad idea if there's kids, don't. And I used to put a rope on my buddy's bike and on the seat, and then he would go around the town, and I would just hold on for dear life, and he'd go really tight into the curb, and I'd swing out really far, and that was the best way to get speed. And my mom sat me down one day. She said, Mark, you got to stop doing this. You're going to get hit by a car. I'm like, where's the evidence? What do you mean I'm going to get hit by a car? I don't have any evidence for this. I've never been hit by a car. I don't know what you're talking about, Mom. She's like, Mark, you got to stop this. I said, no. So literally a couple days later, I'm out on the roller skates. My buddy goes really tight into a curb, and I shoot out like this, and right in front of me, coming full speed, is a car. And I have no option. I'm going fast. And so I go like this. Down on the ground and skid right along the road. My back just gets chopped up and I stop underneath the car. And I looked up at the car, and the first thought I thought was, first thought was, ouch. This is going to hurt. Second thought was, evidence. Now this is connecting with me, Mom. Now I know what you're saying. See, now I've seen this thing. Now I'm willing to believe it. But I've been always the guy who pushes against unless I have evidence. So when it came to the question of God, I started going, man, what? Let's start exploring this on a philosophical. So I had a philosophical journey as a younger son to the Father, where I would say, okay, let's look at the world of science and see if science is pointing toward God or away from God. And I started looking and realizing that the ancients, Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas, they all said that if anything begins to exist, it has to have a cause. So whatever began to exist has to have a cause, has to have something that lived outside of it that caused it to come into being. All right, it's called contingency. The existence of one thing is contingent upon something outside of itself that existed before it. All right, so that every person here, no matter how old you are, your existence is contingent or dependent on two people, your parents, outside of you, meeting one day and loving each other and getting married, and one day, night, there's just a good mood, and you came into existence. I don't know how much you know, but that's what happened. All right, some of you are like, all right, don't think about it too long, but your parents loved one, and so your very existence, all right, is contingent. It's dependent on people outside of you who predated you, causing you to come into being. And so the debate among the ancients was always, well, if we need something that is not us, that exists, if maybe just the universe is eternal. That would be the debate. And so back in the ancients, and there was no real evidence that it wasn't eternal, so they would say there's no need for God because the universe has always existed. The universe is the non-contingent eternal reality, the uncaused thing. And that was a really good argument until the 1920s and 30s when Edwin Hubble looked through his 100-inch telescope and realized that the planets were moving away from each other and the universe was expanding. And he began to realize, no, the universe actually had a beginning. And so anything that begins to exist has to have a cause outside of itself, the non-contingent, uncaused thing. So now science has begun for the last 90 years to wrestle with, well, what do we do with the fact that we know the universe began to exist? And if the universe began to exist, it has to have a cause. And that made me go, man, maybe this whole Christian thing is not as irrational and as illogical as some people made it seem. Where I would turn on the news as a kid growing up, and it was like Christianity, faith was on one side, and then reason and rationale and logic was on the other, and the two people would debate each other, and I would always go with the rational, non-Christian, non-theist, because he was just smarter and more articulate. And he was in a suit, he was usually a professor, and the one on the Christian side was usually, it's a normal, we have Dr. Richard Dawkins, prestigious Oxford, and we have Joe. Joe lives in a trailer, right? It's like, no, not Joe. Why did you get Joe again, CNN? There's other people. So I began working through that, and then I began to work through the reality of my moral being. And I began to realize that there's a real right and there's a real wrong, and there's these absolute moral, objective moral values that are in play as we live our life. And I began to go, well, how do I know what right is and how do I know what wrong is? How do I know in these conversations that I have with people? How do we all know in this room, raise your hand if you don't believe that dropping napalm on babies is wrong? Wow, crazy. All right, so like if you believe it's wrong, then, and so I began to go, hey, why do we all know this? Why do we all have this deep moral construct in us that says certain things are right and certain things are wrong? And it's not based on a cultural construct. Like where we are, because we're close to the border, there's Nexus. We have Nexus passes, Nexus lane, all right? And so if you can get into the Nexus, if you get your Nexus pass, then you can skip ahead of all the peasants who are lined up, all right, for 3 hours to get through the border, and you just shoot through them all, and you're like waving at them because you have your Nexus pass and you have a Nexus lane. Now, here's the mistake I once made. Because what would happen in the discussions I would have with people as I began to understand this moral law and begin to understand that we all kind of own it and we all share it, people used to say to me, well, no, and they still do, that morality is just culturally constructed and it's relativistic and it's based on the person and it's not objective and we don't all agree and you shouldn't put your moral values and project them on other people and other cultures. And so I began to realize that wasn't true when I went through the Nexus lane, when I didn't have a Nexus pass and it was completely by accident. And I went ahead of this lane. It was supposed to be closed, but I just went. I didn't really know. And I went through, and I began to realize that everybody who wasn't in the Nexus lane was a deep moralist. They knew the difference between right and wrong. All right, so much so that when I passed through 3 hours of traffic and then just ducked in front of someone, I looked in my rear view and there were these 3 big guys, all right, in their truck. They just come from fishing or hunting or something, and they're yelling at me, "Oh, what are you doing, man?" Just moral. And for some reason, something snapped in me. I'm like, I put it in park, and I got out and I walked up. I'm like, "I didn't know about the Nexus. What are you doing? I didn't know. What do you want me to do?" And they're like reeling up their windows, like scared of this crazy-eyed guy. I began realizing people have these moral constructs. I would talk to a guy at work. I worked at a Michael's Arts and Crafts store. Right, you have those in America? Okay, yeah, I worked there. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. People say, "Hey, where's the googly eyes?" I go, "Aisle 7," and then I just go out and take a break for like 10 minutes because I have no idea where the googly eyes are. So I'd work there, and the best part about working there was I'd get to talk to all these guys that I worked with about Christianity, and I'd become a Christian, and so I would share with them. And I remember one conversation with a guy. He had a sister, and he said, "Well, I think all morality is just, it's just culturally constructed, and it's relative, and it's not necessarily totally objective." And I said, "Okay, so if you and me and your sister traveled to a jungle somewhere, and we went in there, and there were these people, and that culture existed in such a way where instead of loving their neighbors, they ate their neighbors. And they grabbed your sister, and they just slowly started to, fry her up over the fire, and they ate her. Would you say that they had done something decisively wrong or not?" And he kind of sat and thought a little bit, and he said, "I see where you're going." And then he went, "You're right. You know what? Philosophically, I have to admit that they didn't do anything decisively wrong. They just did something that their culture told them to do, and we shouldn't project our values on them." Now, that was not a worldview I was willing to accept. It's not something I was going to believe. And so I began going, no, I really believe eating people is just wrong. No matter what culture you live in, it's objectively wrong. It's wrong to pull your car up in front of anybody. It's wrong to jump ahead in line. We all know this. Like, test this out. Anybody who says to you, "I believe all morality is relative," just punch them in the neck. And then say, "What? What's wrong? I don't what?" I don't know what I'm talking about. All right. Don't do that. Tell them Pastor Daniel told you to do that. I began to go inside of this whole moral idea. Then I began to deal with the question of evil and suffering, which is one of the great questions that great reason people don't believe in God at all is because there's so much evil and suffering. My dad passed away when I was 15 years old of lung cancer, and I remember standing over his casket and thinking to myself, something about this feels wrong. Not just like I'm sad about it, but it feels like there's a dislodging of reality. It feels like something about this is not just. Which then I started to philosophically go, yeah, but if I have a vision in my mind of the way the universe is supposed to be, that I'm comparing this with, then where did I get this idea of the way the universe was supposed to be? If it's just all culturally constructed, there must be something that tells me that the universe is supposed to be this way. As C.S. Lewis talks about, if there's nothing in this world that satisfies you, it might mean that you were made for another world. And when I stood over my dad's casket, I started asking those deep questions about evil. And I began realizing, you know what? The fact that I just acknowledge that evil and suffering exists is not an evidence against the existence of God. It's actually an evidence for him, because where did I ever get the category of evil to put God on trial if he didn't give it to me? I would never come to a place where I would say this and this and this are evil unless God gave me that moral construct to say, I told you what was evil. And then I began to look at the scriptures. And I began to say, are the scriptures actually legitimate? Because all of Christian faith is dependent on the Bible. And people would start telling me, you can't look at the Bible. The Bible was written by people that, especially the Gospels, it was just, I was reading the Da Vinci Code, right, by Dan Brown. And Dan Brown was saying, don't you know that the stories in the Gospels are just told by people who are trying to gain power, and they're just trying to make Jesus look like God? Don't you realize that that's the reality? And so I started reading the Bible for myself, and I started to see that all of that skepticism just wasn't true. Because what I began to do is I would read these stories that were totally counterproductive to that idea about gaining power, looking good, Jesus being God. Like, I would read these stories, and it would be like, why did they put that story in there? Like, why when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's literally sweating blood, and he's saying, Father, I kind of want this to pass from me. Like, listen, if you're just writing a document that wants to show Jesus as the hero, as the perfect person, as God, you don't put him questioning his vocation in the 11th hour. You don't have, remember the stories where people walk up to Jesus and they're like, hey, Jesus, do you know when you're coming back? And Jesus goes, I don't know. Only the Father knows. Now, if you're writing a document that's like, we want everybody to believe Jesus is God, don't put in the story where the guy comes up and goes, so you're God, right? Yes. You're God. You know everything. You existed before time began. Yes, absolutely. So when are you coming back? I don't have a clue. So you're God. 100%, absolutely. So I'm just wondering when you're coming back. Your guess is as good as mine. What? Why would you put that in there? Why in Mark chapter 6 would you say, and I was reading Mark chapter 6, and it's like he couldn't heal people. I'm like, what do you mean he can't? He's up on the cross, he says, Father, my God, why have you forsaken me? I'm like, you don't put that in stories where you're trying to construct some. The only reason they ever wrote that in the stories is because it's just what happened. And they're not trying to whitewash him. They're just trying to say this is who he was. And so when I began to see those things, I began realizing, man, Christianity might actually be true. Like rationally, not Joe true. like evidence, like run toward the evidence, not run away from it. And then I was faced with the reality of the resurrection. And my question, this is the center point of history, and what do I do with it? And I began realizing all these early disciples died and were tortured. But I grew up watching the Discovery Channel, right? And the History Channel, and they would say, Jesus didn't really die on the cross. He just kind of passed in and out of consciousness and then later woke up. And I was like, then I'd start reading the Bible. I'd be like, I think if the Romans know how to do one thing, it's probably kill people. Like they used to crucify 6,000 people in a day. There wasn't probably many guys that they would shoved a spear through his lungs into his heart sac, spilling out blood and water, and then took him off the cross. And the guy got up and went, that was close. Like what? Like that's the theory. That's the theory. I was like, I don't know if that's the best theory. I don't know if I want to build my life on that. On just maybe he passed out and they took him down thinking he was dead and then he just dusted himself. I just can't do it. All right. So all those things were all part of my philosophical journey. And you have a different journey than mine if you're a younger brother. But all those things were packed into my journey toward the Father. And when I came to the Father, it was this, I'm not worthy to be called your son. And every one of us needs to have a posture like that. So here's what the Father does. But the Father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe. This would have been the Father's robe, which is beautiful because we get God's righteousness. He gets our sin. We get his righteousness. And put it on him, and put a ring on his finger, or put a ring on his hand, and shoes on his feet. And bring the fattened calf and kill it. See, there's sacrifice. and let us eat and celebrate. For my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to celebrate. And so this sacrificial, this would have been the most expensive thing he had as a father. This would have been this is the kind of do it once a year, once in a lifetime calf. And he sends his most prized possession and kills it and sacrifices it to celebrate. That's the whole point of this. That my most precious possession, now in the gospel we see it as his son, is he's willing to send it for a bunch of people, listen, who aren't even worthy of it. He doesn't send his son to die for you and rise from death to give you new life because you deserve it. You're out living recklessly, spending the money that he was, after you've kind of shoved it in his face that I wish you would die early, and you've gone out and done your own thing, and he sends his most prized possession. My friend took care of a house one time. He was house sitting, and what he didn't know was that a few months earlier, the people whose house he was sitting had received a gift from a friend. It was a $7,000 bottle of wine from Italy, and they gave him this gift, and they said, "This is what we want you to drink on your daughter's wedding day." 7,000 bottle of wine. It's going to be the greatest bottle of wine. It's an aged or whatever happens with wine, aged grapes, whatever. So my buddy was house sitting, and they were making spaghetti, and they wanted to use some wine to make it taste better. And so they went down to the cellar and they just pulled a bottle of wine, $7,000 bottle of wine. They obviously didn't have a big price tag on it, $7,000. And popped it and just threw it in the pan, fried up the best tasting pasta they'd ever had in their life. And the people came home and, how'd it go? It was great. We had a great dinner. You should try this pasta. We have some left over. It's great. What's that bottle over there? What? Here's what the younger son shows us. No matter how messed up you are, God is willing to send his most precious thing and spill it for you. Not because you're worthy, not because of you, but in spite of you. And this is where we see the second son. And the second son is many of you in this room as well. Some of you in this room, you identify with the younger son, reckless, non-religious. Others of you are going to connect with the older son. And here's what happens with the older son. Verse 25. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he's received him back safe and sound." Listen to what the older brother does. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, "Look, these many years." Now, look at what he does. "I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command." What did he just do? There's some people in this room that are the non-religious, younger brothers, living recklessly, and there's other people in this room that are this guy. But I've memorized the book of Galatians. You let him in. Don't you know my moral record? Don't you know how righteous I am? Don't you know how many Beth Moore Bible studies I do per week? You owe me. And you know at the end of this story what happens? This older religious brother who's never broken a command, who's been to every church service, every time the church doors are open, he's there. He tithes 10%. He memorizes books of the Bible. He's in every Bible study. He's done everything. And you know what happens at the end of the story? He never comes in. Because it's harder for religious people to relate to the love of the Father. He's left out See, here's what happens. We play a religious game. It becomes very easy, and I see this in my church all the time, to just talk the language. And so here you have a son who says, based on my moral record, look at the command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. Here's what he does, and this is what religious people do. He compares himself. In order to feel righteous in front of God, he compares himself to another person. This is what we do. Now, the Bible says never do this because your righteousness is all about only comparing to the righteousness of God, right? Romans 3, you've fallen short not of the righteousness and the glory of other people, but the glory of God. Never compare yourself to other people because here's the thing. You're always going to find yourself someone who's just way more sinful and wacky than you. Usually it comes out like this. This is where it comes out with my family who are totally non-religious. Here's what they usually do. I say, do you think you're going to go to heaven when you die? And they say, yes. I say, why? They say, because I'm not Hitler. That's the logic. See what they're doing? They're comparing themselves to somebody else. I'm not Hitler. See, the problem with this is the first fight I ever got into in my life, I fought the person and it was over really quick and I did very good. I was young. It was like 3-4 punches in the face and they were done. It was my cousin, Cheryl. Why are you laughing? Now, the second fight I ever got into was Kevin James. Now, Kevin James, I walked into that fight because I'd had the good fight already. I'd had the fight where I'd run really easy. I thought I was a fighter. I thought I was the man. So when I went to fight Kevin James, I was like, well, this is going to be over. 3-4 punches in the face. Problem was Kevin James' fist would just pummel me in the face, and I was like, he's stronger than Cheryl. I can't figure this out. It matters who you're comparing yourself to. And all religious people do is they like to compare and compare and compare and compare and compare. When I came into the church, I had smoked for many, many years. And when I came into the church, it took me actually a long time to stop smoking. I loved Jesus. I would read the Bible. But I was smoking, a pack a day. And I remember one sermon the pastor preached on not being unequally yoked. And I was in Bible college at the time. And someone walked up to my girlfriend at the time who turned out to be my wife. I don't know if that's the right way of saying that. And walked up to her and they said, hey, you're unequally yoked. And she's like, what do you mean? And the guy said, well, I saw Mark. He was smoking outside. She's like, what was he smoking? He's like, cigarettes? She's like, praise God. It's better than what he used to smoke. See, here's the problem. When you look into somebody's life, you have no idea where they started. And our lives are built, religious people's lives are built around comparing and contrasting and playing a game. A religious game where you learn the language and you learn what it is to look a particular way. The question of this is, the older son doesn't do what the younger son did, which was this. I'm a sinner, and I'm not worthy. That's the call to both groups of people in the story. I'm a sinner. I'm not worthy. Let me pray for us. Father, we are unfortunately people who put ourselves in the center of the story of the universe over and over and over again. Some of us in this room, like me, have come from a past of total non-religion and are asking the questions of whether it's rational to accept what the Father has done for them in Jesus. And I pray for them in this moment that they would receive the grace of a loving father who would give up his most prized possession so that they may live, so that, as the text says, they may go from death to life. And that for all the people in this room that spend our time comparing and contrasting and coming before you, showing you our record, showing you our religious accomplishments, trying to barter with you. This is why you owe me health. This is why you owe me wealth. This is why you owe me that these good things should happen and these bad things shouldn't. Let us just be really shaken up by the fact that this older son never comes into the party, and the story leaves him outside because he never came to the place of humility. So let all of us, no matter which brother we identify with, depend on your grace, come towards you, recognizing our unworthiness so that you may make us worthy in Jesus Christ. In whose name we pray these things. Amen.